Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be discussing the market cycle ROI, or return on investment. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. I wanted to talk a little bit about the market cycle ROI. We talked about this a few weeks ago as well, so I just want to provide an update on it. The way that you interpret this is to just look at prior lows for Bitcoin and measure the ROI from that point. This is market cycle 1 and 2 could theoretically be combined into one cycle if you wanted them to be. But for the purposes of this video, we're mainly just going to focus on cycle 3, cycle 4, and cycle 5. So cycle 3 looks like this, right? Where you basically sort of hung around the lows for a while, and then we just sort of we got to move up, and then we just consolidated there for a while, and then just continue to slowly move up. Cycle 5 is actually following this one quite closely at this point, right? The reason I'm making this video is because we were doing the show earlier on NFA Live, and Rob was sort of asking, like, is this cycle different than the ones we previously saw? And so I thought, hey, it's useful to just measure these out from their, from the bear market year lows, 2014, 2018, and 2022, and just look at the ROI, and you can see that it's actually tracking the, that third cycle pretty closely. And at this point, Bitcoin, after reaching these levels, basically then just went sideways for a few months. Now, could this time be different? Could it continue to rise here? Yeah, I mean, there is the spot ETF stuff. Anything's possible, and it's not like it's followed it exactly. I mean, you can see that there have been times where it spiked, whereas in cycle 3 it didn't. And even here, right, Bitcoin was spiking, while in the cycle 3 it was actually moving back to the downside. So it's tracking cycle 3 pretty closely so far, but it's also kind of tracking cycle 4 pretty closely so far as well. In fact, the ROI from the low is actually closer to cycle 4 right now than it is cycle 3. If we look at the ROI from cycle 3 at this point, 393 days in, it was at 2.15. Cycle 4 was at 2.47. Cycle 5 at 2.74. So all three cycles at this point in the cycle had an ROI of between 2 to 3. The lowest that cycle 3 got after day 393 was basically the level that it was at on that day, right? 2.15 or so. The lowest that cycle 4 got after this point was all the way down here at 1.49. But it actually went lower than that if you look at the sort of the lower time frames, like hourly candles, where we had that pretty big wick to the downside. So if you were to go look at that just for reference, just so we know what it actually was, from this level here, it was about at 1.2x, right? Like 20% off the low. So this actually came down to about 1.2 or so. Now again, this was a black swan event. I think it's foolish to go into something saying that something like that has to happen, but I also think it's relevant to consider the risks that are out there, right? Like, there are macro risks that we have to consider. There is the fact that the unemployment rate is trending higher, which wasn't really a factor, I believe, in 2016. If we were to overlay the unemployment rate onto this chart, yeah, so like in 2016, the unemployment rate was just trending down, right? So it was just trending down. And Bitcoin, during this entire downtrend in the unemployment rate, right, this entire downtrend that, essentially lasted for many, many years, you can see that Bitcoin went on this massive bull run, right? On a massive bull run that didn't finish until the end of the post-halving year. This cycle is, the unemployment rate is a little bit different in the sense that it's, found a low over here, and it's starting to potentially trend up. But again, there's no guarantee. What threw a wrench in last cycle, was the pandemic, but arguably it was because the labor market fell apart, right? The unemployment rate was spiking thanks to the pandemic, and that was what led to this pretty big sell-off in Bitcoin and risk assets in general, right? Was this pandemic. And so really the question is well, will we get an event like that again, or will it just slowly climb like it did in 2016? I do think you should be hedged either way, right? My strategy, as I've said, is to just have a Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolio, because Bitcoin will lead any type of bull market, but it also minimizes your downside risk. That has been my strategy. But I also can appreciate why people, speculate in the altcoin market. A lot of the altcoins are moving. And I just want to reiterate that. I mean, we talked about that a few weeks ago, that Total 3 had taken out this prior high, indicating a potential shift in the trend. And rather than pretend like it's not happening, it's just important to say that, look, guys, potentially shift in the trend here compared to these lower highs that we were getting. This is now the first higher high, which is different than everything we've seen previously. So going back to this, one of the things with the market cycle ROI is it sort of brings out this idea of, is this time different or is it not, right? Is it the same? And my view is that it's more or less following what we've previously seen, right? And there can be shakeouts, right? Like we could have a pretty big shakeout next year if a recession materializes. If a soft landing materializes, then it might not happen, right? I cannot make any promises as to what's going to happen. I put out tons of theories this year, some of which panned out, some of which didn't, right? Bitcoin dominance has gone up. Ether Bitcoin has dropped a lot, although it's up today. But then, Bitcoin didn't really go down. I thought that after after what we saw back in the summer and the ETF hype that sort of died off, I kind of just thought that it would be relatively lackluster going into the end of the year, which is clearly not the case. So, I mean, it is important to consider other theories, and they range a lot. I mean, I've seen all sorts of theories out there, and we can go through all of them, or at least some of the major ones. One of which, the most bullish one I've seen, is people calling for new highs this year, which seems unlikely given that it's already December 7th and it's still a ways, Bitcoin is still a ways off from new highs. But again, the market always humbles us and teaches us that anything's possible, so I'm not going to say that it can't happen. It just seems unlikely, but doesn't mean that it can't happen. The next theory that's not as bullish, but still relatively bullish, are people calling for new highs before the halving. That has not occurred previously, at least in the last couple of cycles. I'm trying to think, like, if we went up to this level where cycle 4 was, that would put the ROI at about a 3.2x off the low, right? 3.2x. So if you think about where Bitcoin was in late 2022 at around 15.5, let's just call it 16K. I mean, 3x from there gets you to 48K, and then you can add a little bit more, top it off at just in the low 50s, and that would put you at around where this one was, where cycle 4 was at that point in the cycle, right? So that still wouldn't get you to a new all-time high before the halving. So in order to get to a new all-time high before the halving, you would have to essentially, continue outperforming the last 2 cycles, for the next several months. And right now you can see that the current cycle is ahead of those 2 prior cycles. So you'd have to essentially outperform those on an ongoing basis for the next several months to reach a new high before the halving, right? So there's one theory. People are calling for new highs before the end of the year. Other people are saying, no, it'll be new highs before the halving. It won't happen this year. Other people are saying, the highs will come when they always come, and that'll be either late halving year or sometime in the post-halving year. So in last cycle, we had new highs by the end of the halving year. The cycle before that, we did not get new highs until really, I mean, we had a brief new high here in Q1 of the post-halving year, but we did not have like durable new highs that continued to accelerate until April of the post-halving year, right? So another month or two after this. So yeah, that's the question: is will this time be different or will it be the same, right? Will it take until the end of the halving year or the early part of the post-halving year to hit new highs like it did the last two cycles? Or will we hit new highs much sooner, maybe before the halving, right? That's what I know a lot of people are talking about right now. And, at this point, we're still tracking the last two cycles relatively closely. I think the biggest thing that could throw a wrench into the trajectory, which could delay things like it normally gets delayed until, say, the end of the halving year or sometime in the post-halving year, is if a recession hits, right? And again, like, I don't know if it's going to happen. We have outlined the risks involved. We did a video on the recession risk just a few days ago, and we talked about what risks are elevated, which ones are not elevated. It's impossible to time these things. I have no idea, exactly when something like that could theoretically play out or if it's even going to. But if something like that were to play out at the, either now or in the next several months, then, that could lead to some type of macro high or low or something where then Bitcoin has to build off of that again, just like it did last cycle, right? So there's also that theory, which would then kick the can down the road and put out new highs closer to the end of the halving year or sometime in the post halving year, like we've seen the last couple of cycles, right? If you had some type of macro high or low, or the cycle before that, it was a double bottom. So I mean, it really depends on how the macro continues to evolve, and it evolves very, very slowly. And anything or everything we've seen, right? The economy is not the stock market, right? The stock market loves climbing the wall of worry for as long as it possibly can until the unemployment rate starts to show signs of weakness. And the unemployment rate has started to show a little bit of softening up, but it still has a ways to go. The reason why I'm mentioning it is because we're about to get another unemployment rate print relatively soon on December 8th, and it has been slowly starting to trend up, but it hasn't really made a big break to the upside like we have sometimes seen when the unemployment rate starts to move, right? So sometimes when it starts to move up, it can then continue to move up relatively quickly. This is not something that Bitcoin has experienced, with the exception of this spike here in the unemployment rate. And when that happened, of course, Bitcoin sold off. That was also, a black swan event. So it's hard to know exactly how this will play out. But I think the macro is basically the thing that could theoretically throw a wrench into this. I don't think that anything else, crypto related specifically, would necessarily slow it down. I think it would have to come from the macro environment. And again, I think you should be hedged either way. I'm not saying that, it makes sense to be 100% in the market or 100% out of the market. I think it makes sense to be hedged either way. This has been my view. My portfolio, for the last couple of years has just been Bitcoin heavy, because my argument has been, I don't know what altcoins are going to survive. With that said, I do find it useful to remind myself and others that, Total 3 did put in a higher high. We mentioned this a few weeks ago, and I just want to reiterate that this is, we've seen so many lower highs for a long time, and then this is the first higher high. So a potential shift in the trend that's worth noting and not ignoring. So I do want people to be aware of that. And if you want to take on the risk of the altcoin market, just understand what those risks are. If we were to go into a recession in 2024, then I imagine altcoins would get hit harder than Bitcoin. If we don't go into a recession, then I imagine altcoins would outperform Bitcoin. So at least over a longer period of time. I still think, there's a case to be made that dominance will go up, even though it has had a pretty big hit over the last couple of weeks or over the last couple of days. So those are the main theories, right? So you have your most bullish one, which is new highs this year. Then your next one, which is new highs before the halving. And then your more middle of the ground one, which basically says we'll have a recession sometime in 2024. It'll cool the market off for a while, and then we'll go up after that. And then there's the more bearish view, which would be, a recession sets in and Bitcoin does not go to new highs this cycle, right? So there's all sorts of different theories out there. I think you can find evidence to support all four views. I think a lot of it depends on what your bias is, to be completely honest. But I think there's a lot of evidence you can look to potentially support any of those views. I think that the two extremes are the least likely, right? So I would say new highs this year and no new highs, the extremes are probably the least likely outcomes. And the most likely outcomes are highs next year, or a recession hits, we sort of cool off for a while we deal with the fallout of that, just like we did last cycle, although it could be slower this time rather than just a single spike that gets taken care of with a lot of stimulus. It could be a much slower process. So I would say those two scenarios are probably the most likely out of the four that we just listed. But at this point, the market cycle ROI shows us this time really isn't that different, and that the market can throw us some curveballs along the way, and we don't know exactly when those are going to come. But that is what history shows us when you look at the cycle ROI. So just wanted to come on, do a video. We did a video on the cycle ROI not too long ago, but considering the recent move up, I thought it might be useful to sort of come on here and talk about it again. Anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.